Just a few.
All right, so we're recording, Dorothy.
Okay, so thank you everyone for coming tonight, and please excuse our technical difficulties, and just remember that even with the technical difficulties, it's all a miracle. And it's even more of a miracle that this many people are showing up on December 6th with such short notice. This meeting was requested by SITLA as a follow-up to the presentation they did last June on their plans for the development of the North Temple landfill. And at that time, they had talked about the remediation plan not being really ready till November, so they would get back with us, and they were good to their word. And we wanted to get this presented before people got too distracted with the holidays. So the way we're going to run this is that we will have this meeting and our June meeting both recorded. They'll both be on our website. There's minutes of the last June meeting that you can look at. There will be some minutes on this one also. And what we will ask is we will have the ability to put the presentation on our website if you want to see that. We'll go through the presentation. If you have pressing questions during the presentation, questions that are of a nature that you really need them answered to really understand what's being said. You know, it's does a disservice both to us as attendees and to the presenters if the presenters are talking and there's something that we just don't understand and we kind of miss what they're saying. So if it's a clarification question, you can raise your hand during the presentation, and we'll interrupt and try to get those questions done. If it's not that type of question, then just hold it and type it into the chat. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll go through those questions in the chat. They'll have two functions. One, we can kind of organize what the questions are, but also we'll have those questions in the minutes and the answers in the minutes. And that will help us with that. If at the end of the chat, your question comes up in the chat, you know, Gary, Kyle, Robert, one of them responds to it. If you at that point, there's something you still are unclear about, then you can raise your hand again and we'll just call on you and you can, you know, follow up on your question. So does that,
Works fine
that
for us.
makes sense?
Yeah, works fine for us. Yep.
And
Yeah.
right now, participants, I know you can't unmute, but we will change that. We're just gonna wait until we get into the presentation a bit, and then you'll have that ability
To do that. So with that, then Robert, do you want to take it away?
I will, without further ado, just kick it right over to Gary and Kyle. Thanks for letting us be here tonight. Really
Great.
appreciate it.
Thanks, Rob. What we're going to do tonight, I've got a short presentation here in a PowerPoint. And the idea here is really kind of an update. And Dorothy, you made mention of perhaps a change in plans. I don't know that we've had a change in plans, but I think what we have is much more detail to share with you in terms of timing and what we're looking to do in our first phase. So I'll just, whoever's running the slides, I'll just suggest we go to the next slide, and then as we move forward, we'll go, you know, I'll continue to let you know what slides, but please, next slide. I don't know how many people are on the call that may have not been on the June call. So there's a little bit here of just refreshing people's memory, or for those who were not on the call, you know, a little bit of background. So the North Temple landfill was a landfill that was operated by Salt Lake City from the late 1950s to 1976. It encompasses 770 acres. You can see it along I-80. And that exit right there is 7200 West. The pile of material at the bottom of your screen is concrete that came from the demolition of buildings at City Creek when City Creek was built. And all that is, the larger pile is concrete that was crushed down. And the blue pile to the left is actually granular borrow or fill from the City Creek. All that concrete was manifested. So in other words, all the rebar taking out, there was no any other contaminants within it. So just clean concrete. So that gives you a sense of how large the landfill is. To the left of that slide, which would be the northern part of the property, that red line aligns with 700 North. So that gives you a little bit perspective of how large the landfill is and where it is. If you go to the next slide,
Yes, that goes over again, yeah.
okay. As I mentioned before, the landfill was operated by Salt Lake City as a municipal waste landfill. It's not, when you think about this landfill, how it operated, it was not like it operates a landfill today where it's, 50 feet high. This was what's called a trench landfill. So these were just trenches that were dug with a backhoe or a drag line. So they would dig down a certain amount of feet. When they got to that depth, they would then place the waste in the trench, and then they would fill it back with some of the soil that they had on top. So there was never a cap put on the landfill. And if you look at this graph, you can see the errors in which the waste was placed. So area 1, which will coincide with our phase 1, was put in place in 1959 to 1963. That's when it operated. You can also see that the orientation of the cells in that area go north and south. And if you look at the area to the north of that, they go east and west. So you can see how the landfill was developed. It basically went from the east side of the landfill and worked its way across to the west, with only them to return to the northern portion, which is area 6 in the late 1970s to close out the landfill. As we move from east to west, the waste gets deeper. The waste in area 1 is between 2 and 5 feet deep. When we get to area 5, the waste is in excess of 10 to 12 feet deep. So as you move across the landfill, the waste cells get a little deeper. And that's just a function of the way in which Salt Lake City operated, because as they went further along, they were looking for more capacity. So they dug those trenches a little bit lower. Okay. So now you have a sense of how the landfill was developed, how it was done. The little blue in the middle says Bonneville pile is waste that was relocated from what we refer to as the East landfill. So if you look on your right side of your screen, there's a series of buildings there. Those are buildings that were built by Siegfried, and that moves into the International Center. There was an old portion of a landfill that was located there. In 1995, Suburban Land Reserve, in conjunction with DEQ, moved that waste that was in where those buildings are now to where it looks like where it shows as the Bonneville pile. So that was a relocation of waste that occurred in 1995 in approval with DEQ. And that's kind of the same situation that we're looking to do here as we move forward. It's basically consolidating this waste that we have across the entire landfill into a series of repositories that'll concentrate that waste on the North Temple landfill site. So if we move to the next slide, what we see here is this is what we refer to as phase 1. So as we move forward with the landfill, we're going to remediate it in phases. This is our phase 1 boundary. It's a total of 175 acres, but only 130 or so have any waste in them. And if you see the southern portion of phase 1, there's like a brown marker that goes across there and makes its way across the property. That's the Brighton Canal. That is an irrigation canal operated by Suburban Land Reserve. Its only function today is to bring water from well water out to the duck clubs. That has been turned off now for the last 9 months. That canal will be relocated or be closed down. So that will no longer be part of crossing the landfill. The phase 1 boundary, the waste, the cells that have waste are above that Brighton Canal. So if you look at that, you'll see that dark line that runs through the southern portion. Anything below that is no waste. Area above that is waste. And again, that area runs between 2 and 5 feet. Why we chose phase one to do that first is a couple reasons. One, it is in the southeast corner, and we're going to work our way in remediation across the site east to west. Second is, it is the area that has the least amount of waste, so it's shallower. It has the least amount of leachate. And one of the things that we've talked about with DEQ is that we'll be able to utilize phase one as kind of a proof of concept. And it'll allow us to be able to refine our processes out in the field. So by taking on the area that's probably the least complicated of the landfill, it'll do a couple things. It'll allow us to allow us to test out all the things we're going to talk about today, and then incorporate those things or make modifications in them for later phases. It also allows us to start the development. And with a landfill of this size, we need to be able to develop and be able to monetize some of that land so that we can apply those funds to move across the landfill and remediating that landfill. So that's how phase one has been identified. And again, like I said to you before, it's about 175 acres. If you go to the next slide, I've talked about the history where it came, and go back to this concept. When we looked at this, and I go back before, let me give a little more history for everybody here too. The landfill was operated under a lease with a local family, the Hogle family, by the city of Salt Lake City. In the mid-70s, Suburban Land Reserve, the LDS Church, received a land grant, a donation of a multitude of acres that encompassed the landfill. So there was, I believe, 2,000 acres that all surround the landfill that was donated to the LDS Church. The LDS Church basically inherited that landfill in that lease, but was not an active participant in the landfill operating. When Salt Lake City decided to close the landfill, they closed it in 1978. And at that point in time, that area in the Northwest quadrant was really looked at as an area that was really not ripe for development. It was open area. With the development of the prison and the introduction of infrastructure into that area, then the land around that became backed on people's radar screen, because now there was some reasonable economics if the prison was going to bring in this infrastructure, that these areas could be developed. About that same time, Suburban Land Reserve and SITLA got into negotiations where Suburban Land Reserve actually donated the landfill to SITLA for the benefit of the Utah school education process. That was donated to SITLA with the intent that SITLA would be able to develop that landfill and be able to use those funds to continue their mission of funding education within Utah. Prior to SITLA getting involved, Ninigrit, which is the company I work for, and a company called CDM, prepared a study for the LDS Church of how to go about cleaning up that landfill. You may have heard from other people that at one point in time, there was a consideration of taking all that waste off the landfill and moving into another location, either the Pioneer landfill at along 5600 or out to a landfill in the West Desert. The reality of that is that's extremely costly to excavate it. It creates a tremendous amount of public safety issues because the wet waste in the back of a truck or a rail car leaks out, causes issues on roads, and it just became something that was uneconomical and also brought together a lot of difficulties in terms of public safety. So that notion of taking all the waste off the North Temple landfill was abandoned because it just wasn't practical. When SITLA and Suburban Land Reserve went forward with their agreement to have it donated to SITLA and be able to develop that land and use those proceeds into their trust, we sat down with DEQ and talked about a phased approach for cleanup, but also that we would keep the waste on site. So we would consolidate those waste cells into new repositories, and those repositories would actually have a proper cap on them, so you would minimize any of the infiltration of rainwater into any of the remaining waste. I've talked about before, we think phase one is a proof of concept. It's going to help us with future phases. And as DEQ considers it, it's really a template for future phases. So this is only the first phase. We still will be doing additional investigations with DEQ on other areas of the landfill. I'm going to show you some maps in terms of what we've been testing already, but our ongoing site characterization will continue even while we're doing the phase one remedial action plan for phase one. So if you go to the next slide, I'll show you that the landfill's pretty straightforward. The groundwater, these squiggly blue lines, is groundwater flow. It typically flows in the northwest direction across the site. Every identification on this map here, all the blue dots, they're all test pits that we dug into the various waste cells to do testing on that. All of the green dots in that square in the middle, those are all what's called geoprobes, where we actually went down and we sampled the soil beneath the landfill and we took water samples from that. All the red dots are monitoring wells that we've had in place for some time. So you see them along the northern boundary, the western boundary, and along the southern area. We've probably done in excess of 100 test pits and wells on this site. Now, it's still a 770-acre site, so I'm not going to tell you that we've done everything that feasible, but we have really studied the site over the last 5 years with SITLA and over the last 10 years before that with Suburban Land Reserve. We've also gone out onto the neighboring property, part of which is owned by Rio Tinto and the other one's owned by Comina Group, and you can see those monitoring locations west of our property line on the far left-hand side of your graphic. Those are all wells that were put in to identify what, if anything, is coming off the site. The interesting part about the site, and I don't know, I wouldn't suggest that it was planned, but I think is very fortuitous, is the location of this landfill when they operated is on top of very thick lake clay deposits. So those clay deposits have acted as a barrier of allowing any contaminants in the leachate, which is the water that percolates through the waste and goes into the cell. It's prevented that leachate from impacting groundwater in that area. We have some exceedances in the groundwater, but for example, in the shallow groundwater, we have some exceedances that you would expect in a landfill and far less than you would expect in most landfills. But in terms of the deep groundwater, we've really had no impact whatsoever. You have two factors that contribute to that. One is that the clay underneath the landfill is a low permeability clay and has minimized the infiltration of any contaminants off the site. And the second part is there's an upward gradient and groundwater gradient, whereby the lower aquifer has an upward gradient up into the lower aquifer. So you have two functions that are working together that have minimized any contamination going into the lower, any significant contamination going to the lower aquifer. DEQ likes to refer to what we see out here is a bathtub effect. We basically have these cells that are long longitudinal cells that are all lined with this natural clay. And as a result, we have this perched water within these cells. And that's how we refer to as a bathtub effect. Part of our remediation is going to be, and what we have to address is, as we excavate out these cells, those that have leachate in them, we're going to have to pump that leachate out, manage it, treat it before it's eventually disposed. So that's kind of, you have a sense now, the number of wells and the number of testing we've done out there, and you can kind of get a sense of where the groundwater is flowing. If you go to the next slide, again, we're back to phase one, and it's, again, 175 acres, maybe 125 contained waste, relatively shallow amount of waste. very little leachate, and the total volume that we estimate in those 120 acres is about 800,000 yards. Something that's, even though it sounds like a large number, something that's very manageable. We go to the next slide. What we'll be doing now is we're putting together what's called a remedial action plan. We're working with DEQ to actually put together a plan to how to go about and doing this waste consolidation. That plan will then be submitted to DEQ for initial comments. Once we have the initial comments, it'll then go out as a public document and for public comment. So what we hope to do, and I'll give you some timeframes, we hope to have the remedial action plan, which is referred to as a RAP, R-A-P. We hope to have that to them, the DEQ and Bill Reese's group, by the end of this year, the end of December. They'll take a couple weeks to review it, make their comments or things that they don't think are clear, whatever the case may be. So we would hope that by the end of January, we would have a remedial action plan out for public comment. That public comment period is a 30-day public comment period. If there's questions or other things that need to be answered, that comment period can be extended through DEQ. What we would like to do is geared towards trying to have a remedial action plan approved so that we can start some of our process in the field sometime in late spring, early summer. We can go now. Before we even start any remediation on the site, we have what we call pre-mobilization tasks. We got to set, this is going to be a large construction site. We have to set up the office, we have to set the parking. We have, make sure that we know how to move material across the site. The site will be secured. There'll be security on that. We have to set up our means by how do we manage the leachate. And then we're going to have an odor control system that we're going to have at the active faces at the landfill when we excavate out the waste, as well as along the perimeter, because that's a major concern for us, that we want to minimize any kind of odor concerns. The interesting part about this landfill, and when we've done test pits, is that most of the waste has been decomposed for over 50 years. So the notion of a regular landfill, we have methane gas. Most of that methane gas has already been produced and has been off-gassed. So you don't have a tremendous amount of methane in this landfill. And our guess is it's going to be very minimal. And that's what we've seen in all our test pitting. And we just haven't seen methane that would be associated with the landfill. If we go to the next slide, this is, maybe more engineering that people need to, focus on, but these are our plan for our haul routes. We need to move the waste into the new repository. We need to take fill from that area on the western side of the property and move that over. So this is all the pre-planning that we need to do prior to even putting a shovel in the ground so that we can start excavating waste. So there's a lot of work that gets done even before the remediation process starts. You can go to the next one. This is what the cells look like. And I'm going to have a zoomed up photograph, but this is part of we did with DEQ some years ago, where we actually excavated out a cell. This is about how wide the cell is. You can see from that off-road vehicle and the excavator how big it is. If you look on the right-hand side of the slide, you can actually see the profile. The first 2.5 feet is all cover material. It's just soil. Then you can see the waste underneath it, and then you can see the clay bottom. So if you look at the bottom here, that's just a very hard clay that the waste has been sitting on. We were able, that's pretty well structural. We were able to bring those pieces of equipment and get down on top of that clay and operate from that. So we're looking forward to be able to do that. In phase one, this is what we think we're pretty comfortable. This is the conditions that we're going to encounter. As we move in later phases to the western side of the landfill, that area is going to become a little more complicated in terms of our process, because that's going to have more leachate. You can see in this area here, there's very little liquid at the bottom of the cell. So that would be collected, that'd be pumped out of there, it'd be stored. And then I'll walk you through what we're going to do in terms of evaporation and treatment in a later slide. But if you focus on the right-hand side, you can see the profile that I'm talking about. Cover material, which will be scraped off and put to the side to be reused. And then the solid waste and really decomposed solid waste underneath that. If you go to the next slide, I've tried to zoom in. It's a little fuzzy, but maybe you can get a better sense of how the layers of soil work. So there's your, on the top is your soil, just, nothing unique, just native soil. Then below that is your waste profile, the 2.5 to 3 feet of waste that's on the side of that slope. Okay. Again, this is not rocket science. It's consolidation of waste, but you have to build in a lot of process, safeguards, and those type of activities so that you make this as efficient as possible and least offensive while we're doing this. If you go to the next slide, this is typically what you'd be looking at. You'd have an excavator, as we saw in the picture before, taking the cover off first, then taking out the MSW, municipal solid waste. And then if it's wet waste, what we'll do with the wet waste, we'll let it drain back into the cell, and then we'll pump out that leachate from there. At the back end of the cell, we'll be bringing new structural fill in, clean fill, probably a little bit of layer of gravel at the bottom of the cell. And then as the process moves forward, the excavator and the haul trucks take the waste away, and the bulldozers and the haul trucks bring the material back. So you have a progression where you work your way down a typical cell. Okay. If you go to the next slide, once we get into waste excavation, and this will all be chapters in the remedial action plan, and these will be things that DEQ reviews with us and approves. So one issue we have is waste removal. And that'll be all documented there. How do you pick the waste up? How do you move it? How do you put it in the truck? We'll have an air monitoring plan. We'll have a leachate management plan. How do you collect the leachate from the bottom? How do you pump it? How do you store it? How do we go forward and evaporate it? And then how do we treat it? Special waste, under this terminology, is things that are not going to go into the repository. So that would be a refrigerator, that would be tires, that could be asbestos tiles, or whatever the case may be. So we'll have roll-off containers, and when the people that are working with us, the engineering company that's working with us, has done this before, they'll have roll-off containers. So at any point in time that we see some waste that's not municipal solid waste that's decomposed, that waste will go into a roll-off. If need be, it'll be tested, and then it'll be brought to the appropriate disposal facility. The other operation on the site is waste transport. How do we move that material to the repository? And then the repository itself is, how do we build that repository? How do we manage it on a day-to-day basis? And what does that cap look like? So those are all operations within the waste excavation that'll all be documented in the remedial action plan. We go to the next slide. As I mentioned before, one of our focuses is going to be odor and emission controls. We've already established a baseline odor control by, we flew the landfill with a drone detector that picks up methane and other indicator air quality issues. That looked very good, but it's basically representing what we've seen in the field. Not a lot of methane, not a lot of off gases. But once we open up the landfill, we want to make sure that stays. So at the excavation, we'll have a PID meter, which will read various VOC emissions, and what we call a field olfactometer, which is gauged to actually try to identify a odor as you would do it with your own nose. So those will be at the trench, and we'll be monitoring as we go along. There'll be a dust control program as we're moving trucks back and forth, making sure that that's not an issue. And then we'll have odor control methods. And part of that is going to be that are actually sprayed around the working face. And the same thing at the repository. Any exposed waste will be covered overnight. We'll typically use tarps for that. And when we're building out the repository, when we get to a level where we've put a couple lifts in, then we'll more than likely use cover material, and we'll build what's called an intermediate cover on top of that. That'll give us stability to go to the next lift, but it'll also minimize any vector and odor issues. So we'll have a combination of monitoring, both site-wide and at the excavation in the repository. We'll have odor control methodologies that we'll install, and then we're going to be always making sure that the waste is covered anytime we walk away from a face. So for example, if we're operating in July and we have a big rainstorm, we're not going to operate. That waste will be covered. We'll come back 2 days later, take the tarps off it, and we'll continue with our waste excavation. Okay. If you go to the next slide. Leachate is another issue that we have to address. At the bottom of these cells, like this bathtub that I talked about, not so much in phase one, but we get to later phases, there'll be some leachate. We expect to collect some leachate here on the northern cells of the phase one. We will be developing a leachate pond. That pond, we will take the leachate at the bottom of the cells. We'll pump it to the leachate pond. In the leachate pond will be a holding area, and then that will go into an evaporation system that we've been working on for some time now to find the right mix. And what I mean by that is most leachate evaporation systems that you see at any other landfill are utilize the methane gas as a source of power to run that evaporator. We don't have enough methane at the site, and we don't have a source of natural gas at the site. So we're going to use a different evaporation system, what I'll show you in the next slide or two. But we expect to get between 90 and 95% reduction in the leachate by using this evaporation system that we've been able to work through. Once we have that reduced volume will then be treated with active carbon towers. And that's part of what we did in our pilot study, and I'll show that as well. Once that remaining leachate from the evaporation has been treated with active carbon, we'll then transport that brine to a POTW, and we'll meet their standards. And we were able to do that, the pilot study, when we did that 2 years ago. So I'll show you a little bit about that next. If you go to the next slide. This is the pilot study that we did. Those are all Baker tanks. Those are the activated carbon towers that you see there. We treated about 35,000 to 40,000 gallons of leachate in our pilot study. We took the leachate from all different locations on the landfill in all different eras. So we took leachate from 1950s, took leachate from 1960s, then we combined the leachate from the 70s, the 60s, or whatever. We did some flocculation. We did some ion exchange. We did some carbon filters. So that was all submitted to DEQ a couple of years ago. So we have a good sense of what we need to do in terms of that leachate. As I mentioned to you, this was all set up there. This would be similar to what you would see on the treatment side after the evaporation. If you go to the next slide, this is the evaporation system we'll be utilizing. That green tank there is the storage tank. So you would take leachate from the holding pond, pump it into the storage tank, and then it would go through this evaporator. If you think of this evaporator, it's really just thin sheets of plastic that allows the leachate to come in contact with the air. Obviously in Utah, in Salt Lake City specifically, in the summer, we have a tremendous amount, a great setup for evaporation. And this system, without the use of methane gas to power it, it has to be powered with electricity in terms of the fans, but this should give us that 90 to 95% reduction in the leachate. So this is a very encouraging technology that we'll utilize. And this technology can then be moved from location to location as we move into the subsequent phases of the landfill remediation. If you go to the next slide, as I mentioned before, this is a 770 acre landfill. We've done 80, 90 test pits. We've not found anything. We've never found skull and crossbones, no drums, none of that kind of stuff, but it's a 770 acre landfill. So we need to prepare for finding things that we don't anticipate. We know we're going to find tires. They don't disintegrate. We've found them before. There'll be occasional refrigerator or whatever the case may be. On other locations where we've done this, we've found asbestos materials in tiles that we take in and we dispose of correctly. So this will be something that we'll spend time on, and this will be something that we'll be working with DEQ on as well. We will also have a spotter out there. That'll be a third-party spotter working with us, making sure that as we go forward, that anything that we see unusual in our excavation, that we identify it, and if necessary, we collect it and then treat it. Okay, let's go next slide.
Gary, you went on mute there.
I was trying to keep the cuckoo clocks away from bothering you guys. First thing we do is we remove the cover material. We take the dry waste, we put it into haul vehicles. The wet waste is put on the edge of the trench. It's allowed back to drain back into the excavated cell, where we then collect it. As I mentioned before, any exposed waste is covered with tarps on a daily basis. If you go to the next slide. Okay, these are some of the tarps I was mentioning before. You can see where they kind of roll out. And we have a machine like this that'll pull over the top of that, and that minimizes the odor and a lot of the vector control issues. Okay. You can go to the next slide.
We lost them again.
No, you still got me. Okay. Kyle knows this. This is my wife's desire to have a cuckoo clock and a grandfather clock in the house. So we just went past an hour here. So we got some musical backgrounds. So this is the location that we've identified for the repository. It would be just west of phase 1, as you can see that. The long longitudinal area is the repository. That was about 35 acres. And that will house the 800,000 yards of waste. This will not be a big pile. It'll be something that is, I said, 35 acres, or 32 acres actually, maybe close to 18 to 19 feet in height, with a 4-to-1 slope. So it's a gentle slope on this. So this is not your typical landfill that you see that's 60 and 70, 80 feet in the height. But it is something that will blend in with the surrounding areas. Okay. Okay. Next slide, if you could. Okay. The repository I mentioned before, about 32 acres. That's where we're going to place the waste. We'll do that in lifts. After a couple lifts, we'll actually put intermediate soil on top of it. That gives us another base that we can go on top of, gives us stability, and also minimizes any odors and vector issues. That's the intermediate cover. We'll have odor control, as I mentioned before, at the location of the repository. And once the repository is filled, we'll have a final cap. Now, the operation of the repository is similar to what was done for the relocation from NTL East with Bonneville, but this will be a much more improved cap. If you go to the next slide, the cap will look like a now current landfill cap. So you'll have a geotechnical membrane on that. You'll have areas for collecting the gas beneath the membrane. You'll have a drainage layer. You'll have 2 to 3 feet of vegetative layer on top of that. So as you have rainfall come down into that vegetative waste, it'll get it on top of the geotextile. It'll go into the drainage layer. You'll have a stormwater prevention system on that. The HDPE liner will prevent any additional percolation into the waste and minimize any leachate in terms of that. And then if we do get any gas from this relocation, we'll be able to collect that in the perforated pipes that are built just underneath the liner. This is a much greater improvement from what was done on the Bonneville pile or anything that was done at NTL. This is basically a current modern landfill cap that we'll be placing on this new repository. Okay. Go to the next slide. With the remedial action plan, we have to have a series of plans that are part of the wrap. We'll have a health and safety plan, that's your HASPAT. We have the stormwater pollution prevention plan. You have a special waste handling plan. You have the community air monitoring plan. And then one of the things that I've talked to DEQ about is, as I mentioned before, they'll be on site on a regular basis. We want to learn from them, take our experience here and make sure that we refine that so we can move on to later phases and then and incorporate that. So what we'll be doing is we'll have weekly meetings on site with DEQ, and we'll have weekly reports that'll be available to them as well. So we'll monitor how much waste we're able to move. We'll monitor any concerns we have. We'll monitor any kind of work stoppages. We'll monitor the amount of leachate that we're collecting, that we're running through the evaporator. So all that will be documented as we move forward. Next slide, if you wouldn't mind. Okay, so that's pretty much, again, the presentation. I hope I didn't take too long for that. I hope it gave you a good sense of what we're trying to do. But at this point in time,
It's like a long-
Kyle or Robert, if you want to answer any other questions, that'd be great.
So I've tried to answer some of the questions as they come in on chat. I don't know if if you still have further follow-up questions. One of the questions, Gary, though, that I didn't answer, that I thought probably would take a little bit more, just a written answer, was talking about in the past, they had heard that there's arsenic in the water test pits off to the west, and that would be towards the Rio Tinto property.
Right.
So if you want to address that and
Sure.
how we
Yeah.
treat that.
Oh, that's right. Arsenic is arsenic levels in Salt Lake Valley are normally very high. Nothing to do with any industrial stuff. It's just naturally high concentrations within the soil. We have some areas on the western side of the landfill where that concentration is higher than the eastern side. More than likely, some of those higher concentrations are a result of the landfilling efforts. In discussions with DEQ, part of what we're going to be doing is a risk assessment. And that risk assessment will identify those levels. These are not levels that are toxic from a human toxicology standpoint or wildlife standpoint, but they are elevated levels on the western side greater than they were on the eastern side. But I think when it comes to arsenic, and all those who practice in the valley will tell you that's a naturally occurring metal that's high across the entire valley.
Okay, so did that answer? I'm sorry, I can't try to look to see who if that answer, who asked that. Heather, did that answer your question? I don't know if you can actually respond. I don't know if you're set up to do that yet.
You should be able to unmute if you'd like.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I wanted to know if there's anything besides arsenic in the leachate that is of concern.
Yes, there are other things in there. There's some volatile organics. There's some semi-volatile organics. There's some metals. If you go to DEQ's website, they have a series of reports. Let me just give you a sense of reports. We've done with SITLA, we've probably done 4 reports. We now have a separate report going in that'll be finalized in the next week, which is all the most recent information on phase one and a couple other areas across the site. If you look at that, we've established that UDEC has established a screening level or project screening level for various contaminants based upon drinking water standards. Okay, the leachate itself has a series of compounds, both semi-volatile organics, so petroleum products and those type of things that exceed that project screening level for drinking water. And it's not necessarily applicable, but that's the standard that you'll see when we talk about exceedances. If you ask DEQ, and we work for, there's very little in terms of things that are going off the site that are problematic as we move for the site. In the southwest corner, we have an area where there's elevated concentrations of some of these compounds that we're working on with them to find a fix so those chemicals or those compounds do not leave the site. That's part of the future investigation and remedial action to figure out how to address those areas specifically on the southwest portion of the site. So the answer is yes, there's other compounds that are in the leachate that we're going to have to deal with and we're going to have to treat before we do any disposal into a PLTW.
Okay, I'm going to ask, Terry Marasmus had his hand up for a while. So Terry,
Sure.
can we have,
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah,
Gary, is it my understanding your company has invested or owns part of this site? Is that correct, or am I wrong?
No, not at all. The land is owned by SITLA. We have an agreement, SITLA and I have worked together. So we're the development partner and the remediation partner. So our company is managing the remediation on behalf of SITLA, but SITLA is the landowner.
But will your company be developing that property?
Our company will likely not be developing the property. We'll probably be going out to another developer or an end user to develop the property. We'll be laying out the master planning, the roads, the utilities and those things, but we will not be doing the vertical development.
Okay,
so following up on that, Gary, does Ninigret or one of the companies have a percentage interest in whatever profits are result from this development?
We have an interest in that development, depending on how that goes. Yes. So that's how we'd be compensated.
so
That's very dependent upon that. Good, Kyle.
yeah, and I was gonna say, that's very typical of the way that we'll do business in our development group. We have a very small staff, and so we rely on partners to come in to help us get just the backbone infrastructure, master planning, in this case, waste remediation, because we don't have anyone with that kind of expertise on our staff at SITLA, and they'll come in and they'll generally get a percentage of whatever profits come up or a percentage payment of ongoing revenue that's market-based.
Terry, did you have another question?
yeah. I'm really troubled with this. So you have an interest, you're working the property, you're selling it to the community, and yet you could be benefiting from it. So I'm just seeing personally a huge conflict of interest here. And that's all I'm going to say about that for now.
Terrence, can you explain that to me? What's the conflict of interest? I'm not understanding it.
You said that you will gain some profit if this place is developed. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, yes, well, sure.
So what don't you see about that?
So what's the conflict of interest? What are you afraid of out of that? What do you think's
I'm
going to
afraid,
happen?
well, you're presenting to the community, and with the conflict of interest, the fact that you're going to gain from this, for me, lowers your credibility. Now, if this was completely neutral and you're being paid as a contractor and have no future interest in this, that's a totally different story.
Okay, but Terrence, I would say to you two things. One, I don't believe there is, but two, we're doing this in conjunction with DEQ. So everything we do goes through them. Everything we do gets approved by them. So all the remediation activities has to be evaluated, studied, submitted to DEQ, and only with their approval can we go forward with the remediation. So you've got us as a private entity working with SITLA to work this through. Our form of compensation is a percentage rather than you said a fee, I guess. But you've also got a third party in your state agency that is overseeing this and is going to be the one that's going to approve the plan.
I'm finished with my comments. Thanks.
Fair enough.
Some other questions here? Allison, do you see some other things there?
We had some questions. We did have some questions coming through the chat. Sorry, y'all. I'm trying to see which ones haven't been answered yet. And Kyle, I don't know if you've seen some too.
Yeah, let me get to those just in a second. So forgive me, give me just 1 second just to kind of read
Oh,
through
you're
the
okay.
last few I haven't got to yet. Okay. So let's go through a couple of these. One of the questions that was asked was, has this process been successfully done before? The answer to that is yes. In numerous places around the US and Western Europe and Canada, this brownfield development has been done over and over. I'm sure we can, through DEQ or through ourselves, we can get you the names of those places where that's been accomplished. So let's see. Before I get into the POTW and the brine, let's go to some that'll be a little bit quicker to maybe answer. One of the questions was had a couple people ask this, where will the fill material come from? Fill material will come from market places for clean fill. There are pit runs that you can make from other places that need to get rid of excess material that's clean. This is a pretty standard practice in the market with development, that you'll bring in clean fill from various places. You can buy those from various vendors, various landowners, or we could bring it even from some of our own land, maybe in Tooele County for that. Did that answer that question, or any follow-up to that?
Thank you.
Okay. All right. So
Kyle, can you talk about who's paying for this work?
yes, I can. Do you want to talk about that or the leachate? Which is sexier to you?
Follow the money.
Follow the money. Okay. So paying for the remediation has always been kind of something of a sticking point. So let's be very clear. The waste is Salt Lake City's. They operated the landfill. They have the vast liability for the remediation of the waste itself. They're what they call a potential responsible party under environmental law. There are 11 other identified potential responsible parties with a very minor interest in the landfill waste that own responsibility for it. Those include Magna, Midvale, Cypress, all sorts of, state agencies and others who happen to dump there over the past under contract with Salt Lake City. Before the Inland Port Authority was created, and I'll give you a little history here, we had been working with Salt Lake City, Salt Lake County on behalf of the other PRPs and the school district to help use tax increment created off of this site and this site only to help pay for the cleanup of this site and the remediation of it. Because whether it's developed or not, it needs to be remediated at some point. So we were looking at that. When the Inland Port Authority came, we all know that they came and they took the city's increment. The city has since clawed back a little bit of that, although probably not enough of it back, but they have clawed some of that back. So as we're looking at it as it stands now, we're going to look at trying to pay for this under a multi-prong approach. One is to, within our own property, to put a public infrastructure district on that would allow us to essentially tax ourselves above and beyond what the property tax would be. 2 would be the value of the property. Some of the increased value would be sunk back into paying for it. And 3 would be to talk to those people who have increment on the property to look at contributing a portion of that increment towards cleanup to help take care of the liability. The last thing we want to do is sue Salt Lake City or stick Salt Lake City with a large $130 million bill. So Dorothy, I hope that was, I want to make it easy for you to follow the money. So I hope that
So
helped.
the $130 million applies just to phase one.
No, that would be site-wide.
Okay, and so is the costing out of this, are we looking at costing out the whole thing? Or are we just looking at phase one?
Well,
Then
for
this amount, we're gonna do this.
Well, for right now, the remedial action plan is for phase one. So that's the proof of concept, and that's what we'll look at coming out of the gate. But let's be clear, the whole site needs to be remediated. So over time, we're going to need to look at that. But for right now, this remedial action plan is for phase one. There will be future remedial action plans for future phases as more investigation is done.
So how much of the cost would it be just to do phase one?
So Gary, that's somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 million, right? So Gary, you're on mute.
Sorry, I'm sorry about that. About $30 million, but that $30 million incorporates a lot of the safeguards that we would put in place for phase one that would be applicable for the balance of the site.
Carrie, did you have something to add on this topic?
So just so is it clear to everybody that there's 3 options? You want to go through the 3 options of how this could be paid?
Well,
Again,
it's not 3 options that are independent from one another, but 3 options that'll more than likely be woven together. And actually, there's probably 4 options there. So the first option is for us to essentially tax ourselves by putting an extra mill levy on the property that burdens just our property above and beyond property tax. So that's number 1. Number 2 is to use some of the excess value. So actually give up some of the profit into the property to help pay for ourselves. Yes, meaning SITLA, Heather, sorry. So yeah, ourselves meaning SITLA's property. So number 2 is to take some of the profits that we would derive and sink that back into the cleanup. Number 3 is to look for tax increment being given to the property or being given to help clean up and mitigate from those that collect increment. The Inland Port Authority is the largest collector of increment now. I mean, so we're talking to them to try to get them to see if that's something that we can do. Salt Lake City would probably have a seat at that table and probably should, since they have the liability. So that would be the third. And a fourth that I didn't mention is to look for outside sources of funding, whether those are EPA grants, which we're not going to get one big enough to pay for the whole thing. That's just not available, or extra one-time monies, whether that comes from, who knows where, right? Some sort of environmental cleanup or mitigation funds, one-time monies from the legislature, heaven forbid to the legislature that they do that, or something like that. So those are the 4 areas that we can look at that we hope to get some sort of combination of to help fund the cleanup and the mitigation. Did that, Terrence, I think you had a comment before. I don't know if I ended up answering your question in that round, but.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about the inland port. So I have, and you made that clear.
Okay, all right. So the inland port is involved in this, and let's get that out of the way because I know that question's probably coming. Number 1, because they control the increment. And number 2 is we'll have rail access to the property, but rail access only just in the traditional sense of the word, that it will access a building. We'll have a rail spur that'll go through and access. So that would be the extent of the rail that we foresee on our property. Okay, there's more questions. Any follow-up on those topics before I'll get off onto the ones that have been rolling in on the chat?
The POTW, maybe Kyle,
yeah.
was that one next?
Yeah, so the question about, so the question, Gary, and maybe you can help with this as well. So the first question was why leachate going to a POTW? And I was saying that was a repository that DEQ has identified as taking
Right.
that once it's treated. The question is, could you explain how the organics in the leachate will not be spread via the POTW's discharge as a part of their operation?
Sure. Well, that's part, that all goes to the treatment that we do on site. So between the evaporation and then utilizing the activated carbon, that will take, that'll remove those contaminants. And anything that we take to a POTW will have to meet their pre-treatment standards. So in other words, any liquid, any discharge that goes to a POTW from any industrial location has to meet their pre-treatment standards. So we will meet that. And we feel very comfortable and confident based upon our pilot study that after evaporation, some flocculation, we can treat that with the activated carbon and meet the POTW's pre-treatment standards.
So can you just, for everybody, Gary, define flocculation? Because it sounds like some
Okay.
medieval torture that we're going
Fair
through.
enough. Flocculation is to add a additive whereby metals in suspended solids in the leachate will fall out into that flock, into that. So if you took, how would you go about, what's a good example? That flocculation absorbs those other the compounds and it settles out as a solid. Then that solid gets disposed of.
I'm going to come back to the wildlife one. I'm not skipping it forever. Let me just get to some of these others. Will you eventually sell this remediated property? Yes. That's the short answer. Yes, it will be sold. And the profits will go to SITLA into the permanent fund for public education.
So Kyle, can
then-
you talk a little bit about how the, is who gets the decision of who you sell the land to? Is that going to be based upon who is paying for this up front?
Meaning, I'm not sure I'm following what you're asking. Like who's paying for the remediation?
Yeah, maybe, let me ask the question a little bit better. Could you kind of explain how people put up $130 million to clean this up, and then they're going to get their money back when it's sold? So what's the relationship between the people who are putting up the $130 million and the people who are then, buying the property at the end?
Well, let's talk a little bit about how the remediation funding, when you say repaid, I think that's maybe a little bit of a misnomer. So the portion that we would put up, so through mitigation, through the extra mill levy on our property and through tax increment is paid for by whoever's using the property. So they pay for that through property tax. So that's paid by whoever the end user is on the property. So if we were to put up a warehouse on that property, like Amazon would pay the property taxes, and those property taxes would repay the bond to clean up the property. Other than that, the money would come either out of our profits, so we would never see it, or it would come out of some other one-time money that would be of a grant status. So the money, no one's fronting that money. That money would be bonded against increment that would be produced on the property. So the end user would pay for that. And that's kind of the whole point. If you were to look at, it has to be mitigated, right? Eventually this has to be mitigated. There are three ways that you can do that. You can just cap the whole thing in place, and have no uses on it. That's about a 60 to $100 million, Gary,
Yeah,
right?
Call it 60.
Yeah, let's call it $60 million proposition to do that with no way to pay for it, right? We cap it, we send a bill to Salt Lake City. Salt Lake City takes 60 million out of their budget to pay for it. Or whatever, however that works. A second way is what Gary talked about that SLR had looked at one point, which is just hauling it all off and replacing it with clean fill. If you do that, you've got all the things that Gary mentioned, the environmental factors of hauling wet waste around town. The cost is upwards of 300 million or more to
Correct.
do that by the time you're done. There's all sorts of issues. The brownfield way here is kind of that middle ground, right? Where we can consolidate it. It's a known practice that EPA has approved across the country and other Western European regions have approved through their environmental regulatory agencies. So this is a brownfield mitigation. It allows us to recoup about 640 to 660 acres of the 770 to put into productive use that then can help pay for the remediation. So that money doesn't come out of the coffers of any existing organization. It's being paid for. In essence, the land is paying for its own rebirth and its own mitigation. And that's probably the most cost-effective way to go about that. So, so that's answering the question about the repayment. Now, if I jump to the second part of that question, or the second implied part, Dorothy, which is who decides who gets to buy it? So our process, it'll go through our process at SITLA, which will be, we will more than likely do a two-step process with this. We'll do an RFQ, a request for qualifications on an end developer. And that will be, is this person well capitalized? Can this person execute? Can this person deal with the environmental issues? All of these kinds of things that we look for in a company. Weed that out and then go to a request for proposal to what goes on the property. What we intend to go on the property basically matches what the master plan of Salt Lake City was before the inland port existed, which is an extension of the Northwest Quadrant and the International Center. Very similar uses to that going forward. So we're not intending to come in and reinvent the wheel or do anything really weird here. There's no carnivals or fairgrounds or anything. It's just going to be a lot of what you already see in that area and was already approved under the master plan of Salt Lake City. And I can't remember the year. Dita could probably help me with that one, but 2009 Dita, I want to say, or 2008. I can't remember when the last round was pre-inland port.
Actually, it was 2016.
Oh, was it 6? Okay, so it's sooner. It's more recent than I was giving it credit for. Thank you. So did that, on that question, did that answer the question, or are there more? I want to make sure I'm not missing something. Dorothy, did that answer your question? Okay.
Yeah, I don't want to monopolize it because it's, but the cost question, of course, is critical and that. So why don't we go on with the rest of it as these people have other issues, particularly if the reason I bring it up is if part of the funding is dependent on the Utah Inland Port agreement to give part of their increment. We know from the last 5 years, they have not been willing to do that. And so you have to have a really good reason for them to give up their increment. And that's what I'm trying to get at. What's your really good reason for the inland port to give up their increment?
Well, that's a good question, Dorothy. And I'm not going to say that it's been easy with the Inland Port Authority, but we are working with them. And I think the reason has more to do with economic development and outside pressures pressuring the inland port to go along with this. So I don't have a deal with them right now. I'd like to say that my good looks, charms, and fancy footwork will get it done, but I'm not sure that's enough. So let's see. So the only question I have sitting out here on chat that I think we haven't answered goes to, this is from Dan. So it goes to mitigate losses in valuable watchable wildlife. You talked about antelope, deer, burrowing owls, Chinese ringneck pheasants, and a canal pond that had 100 mallards last week and so forth. Part of that will be explored in the remedial action plan. And I'm not sure if DEQ will do that in collaboration with DWR to look at those mitigation impacts. SITLA doesn't have enough wildlife staff on board. I can't provide that expertise from my agency. Gary, I don't know if you have anything to fill in there, but
No, I think that's right. I think, over time, as the landfill gets developed, we'll have to see what that is. One thing I would say to you is that, our most recent conversations with Rio Tinto, the area which is west of our landfill is not slated for any development, Kyle. That's a buffer area to their tailing ponds. The major landowner in the entire area under that master plan is still Rio Tinto. I think they're looking to develop some of that land, but a good portion of that land has been set aside for no development. So that might be a source of further conversation with them.
yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, we've had conversations with Rio Tinto about doing some joint planning in the area, and part of that planning would be connectivity in the open space corridors to provide for wildlife migration and other pedestrian access and those types of things where it makes sense. You don't want to do that in a vacuum just on the 770 acres. You want to have a plan that addresses that area wide.
And so let me flesh that out a little bit more. This is Dan again. So my most recent count of a herd of antelope that was on that phase 1 area was about 55 antelope. Where else in America, seriously, could you find that kind of watchable wildlife within 5 minutes of Salt Lake, downtown Salt Lake City? I mean, it's worth a fortune. There's anything else comparable that I know of anywhere in America. Yeah. And and the pheasants are just really cool. They're just really bizarre. And so however that happened. But anyway, it would be a big loss, and shifting that irrigation canal to, for the duck clubs somewhere else, probably to the north, is really going to compromise all of that wildlife value, including the migratory mallards that land in there. I tried to shoot one today. SITLA allows hunting and fishing, right?
Yeah, but I don't know if I cop to shooting a firearm in city limits. So.
Oh no, it's fine. That's legal. It is legal. DWR has the restriction on that, and it's 600 feet from Amazon.
There you go.
All right.
Yeah, or whatever it is, from an occupied dwelling. So I was good. So anyway, you can
yeah, again, the wildlife portion of it, Dan, is something that'll be fleshed out a little bit more in the remedial action plan. And the concern as well is, what's outside of our control that surrounds it, that may get cut off by development as well. So that goes back to my point about trying to do some cooperative planning with Rio Tinto, with Colmena, and even with the state out by the prison site, to ensure that you leave some of these corridors open, because even if we were to leave our space open, but it got cut off, that's still going to be a detriment to wildlife. So there needs to be a really good comprehensive plan there that even goes beyond our parcel. And that's probably worth a conversation with DWR, who could help us flesh out what that looks like.
Antelope have already run through one older fence out there. You get they're fast, and there's a lot of them, and so they get a whole herd crashing into a barbed wire fence.
Right.
And this issue has been going on.
Let's go to the one question we have here. How does rail figure into the plan? Since rail is what Rio Tinto and Comina both have advocated for this property for the last 5 years.
Right. So, I wasn't on the last call, so I don't know if I'm repeating or giving new information, but rail, what we envision is that rail will be a rail, 1 or 2 rail lines that will feed up the east side of the property and then transect our property about 2/3 the way up. 2 rail lines that would transect our property. And I'm sorry, I don't have the
Graphic. Yeah.
graphic up. Thank you. It's getting late. They would transect our property and then feed Colmena and Rio Tinto. And what they do with them from there, I don't know. That would just be what we would do with spurs that would feed off of our rail to rail served buildings for buildings that would need rail service. So that's the extent of how we see rail playing into our property.
Kyle, just reinforce again, and we said it earlier, because I know there's been a lot of earlier thought that there was going to be a rail yard,
Right.
or whatever the case on our property. There was even some graphics that people showed a rail yard. SITLA has no interest in having a rail yard on our property. That's not where we're going. The only thing we've agreed to do is provide a rail spur onto the property and across it to allow for rail served buildings should an end user or someone come in that wants to have rail served. So they have 2 modes of transportation, right? They have a rail transportation and they have truck transportation, but there is no rail yard that is going to be on SITLA property.
Yeah, there's just simply, it just economically does not make sense for us to do that. It's not in our mission. It's not what we do. So that's the extent of how rail plays into the plan.
Any follow-up questions on that people have?
And just again, to Nancy's comment about UIPA be more amenable to sharing the tax increment from their own PID because SITLA site is so strategic. That is part of the argument we're making. Nancy, you hit it right on the head. So maybe I'll call you the next time I meet with the Inland Port Authority to help make that argument. I'm judging by your laughter, you're probably not amenable to that. So
You got that right.
Hi,
understatement of the year, huh?
What affiliation?
Gary, did you want to ask your question?
yeah, quickly, there was a comment made, I think by Gary, that the site is sitting on a solid, thick, some sort of clay bed. But what evidence do you have that that isn't cracked by historical earthquakes, including the one a couple of years ago?
Well, Terrence, what I said was, Clara said, I said it's underlined by lake clays that when we've done our geotechnical investigations, we've identified clay lenses anywhere from 7 to 15 to 20 feet and down as far as 40. So I'm not suggesting at all that there's a 20-foot clay liner under the landfill. I'm saying that the native soil, which is the low permeability clay, has minimized any opportunity for migration down into lower groundwater containers. So there are sure opportunities to have, whether it be a sand stringer or whatever the case may be, among those clays. But the clay, the natural clay, has really benefited by minimizing the potential contamination into a lower groundwater aquifer.
But are you assuming there are no cracks in this clay?
No, I'm not assuming that at all.
Okay.
Yeah, we haven't found any evidence of that at this point, but that will bear more investigation in future phases for sure.
Gary, I've got one question that relates directly to that, and that is, you might find some lenses of sand when you are, more permeable material. When you find those, not cracked from an earthquake, but how you plan on, you got to dig down, backfill it with the clay?
Well, no, but the idea being in those areas, what is in those areas, in that phase one, we're going to close that entire area. So the waste will be taken out of that. So that waste will have been removed. So we're talking about what historically has been going on. So when you remove that waste, there's no more source for that leachate to be generated.
Any more questions at this point? It's now 8:43,
We started late.
but we did start.
Well, yeah, but not to anyone's fault. And we did tell them it would be till 8:30.
We're only 13 minutes late. For Utah standards, that's not bad. So,
So at this point, what's the next step for us as a community as we follow this process, and what are your next step and what you want to see achieved by this meeting?
Our next step is, the purpose of this meeting was to provide you an update on where we are in terms of moving forward with the remedial action plan and the investigations we've done to the landfill. So our next step is to produce the remedial action plan, get it into a full document, a report, and get that to DEQ, have them review it, and then put it out to public comment. So we will have all the things that I briefly went over today. We'll have those specifics in detail so everybody can review how we intend to go about the remediation process on phase one.
And will that include the financing of all of this?
No, that's totally separate.
yeah, DEQ doesn't get involved in that.
That's not part of that. This is just the remediation phase of what we're trying to accomplish and move that forward.
And the financing phase will become when? Because that's part of the question, is remediating for what? What are we
Right.
purchasing? What are we remediating for? And what are we purchasing? And that's what we can tell our citizens.
Right.
This is why
Well-
it's worth $130 million, because this is what we're going to end up at the end. And this is what's going to cost us. And that's what would be
Well,
helpful for us.
Dorothy,
to
what do you
find
mean by
out.
cost us?
Yeah, I want to understand that too, because keep in mind, any payment for this would come from the people who are on our property. The businesses on our property would be the ones that would pay for this. This would not come out of the general coffers of the city or the county unless something went really haywire and ended up in some sort of suit to do that, which we have no stomach to do. The payment will come completely off of increment created on whatever businesses are put on the old landfill, and they would pay for the
But
remediation.
those businesses have their money from somewhere. And
Sure.
you have to come up with that money, and you have to have a certain density to create that type of profit. You have to have a certain level of production to create that profit. And that's part of the community concern. What type of pollution, what type of density, what type of traffic will have to be generated in order to create the type of money we're talking about?
Well, for right now, the land plan, Dorothy, that we envision matches what's already on the city's pre-existing master plan. So what the city had already approved in 2016, we're not looking at exceeding as far as densities or businesses or those at this point. That's not where we're going. So that land use has already been vetted through the city, and we'll go through. There's two land use authorities. It's a little confusing right now in that area because the Inland Port Authority is a land use authority and the city is a land use authority, and they overlay one another. Now, I know there's a big lawsuit about that, and we'll just wait to see what what ends up happening with that. But those uses are kind of already determined in our eyes as to what will go there. So, and we feel like we can finance it based on the uses that have already been master planned in that area. So we don't, in other words, Dorothy, we don't feel like we need to come back and do something extraordinary or above and beyond what had already been planned there before the inlet port came into being.
Anything else? Well, then I guess Robert, do you have anything that you want to add to this since you helped put this together?
No, I think Gary and Kyle have done a great job and very pleased with all the comments and questions. So again, just thank you very much for being so accommodating and willing to listen to us and helping us follow through with our commitments and in communicating to you and keeping you up to date. So other than that, I don't. Thank you personally, Dorothy, with me.
Let me just really quick before we go, if I can, Rob, let me give you my email. I won't give you my home number, but I'll give you my email. And if there's any follow-up questions or concerns you have, my email box is open. And what I was.
Are you putting that in the chat?
I can. Does it record the chat? I just don't want to.
We save it, so it'll allow us to save it.
Okay. All right. I am putting my email in the chat. Let me make sure I've got it right. Okay. So, and I did spell my last name right. There's no I in it. So I did spell it right.
Did it go to everyone, Kyle?
No, sorry. So I just went to Dorothy. Sorry about that. Okay, thank you, Allison, for catching that. Yeah. So make sure I've got that right. Okay. All right, that now should have gone to everyone.
Yes.
So that's my email. My email box is open. Again, we want to be as transparent as we can. So feel free to email me with any concerns that you have, questions, comments, complaints, criticisms, whatever. Just.
And then Kyle,
yeah,
you're going to be talking with us again about the public comment period and getting back to, or who will be getting back to us about those things?
Yeah, we'll get back to you and let you know when it goes to the public comment period for DEQ. This should have covered kind of the 20,000 foot level of what that will look like. But when that's out, if you have questions directly for us, again, you can get a hold of us, but we'll let you know. And then, if there's a reason to reconvene, or maybe if you want us to just come in even for a few minutes in one of your meetings, we can do that in a future date. So.
Yeah, just keep in touch, Dorothy. You're not done hearing from us. So.
Okay, well, thank you first for all of this and for your valuable time to be here.
You bet.
During this time, and we weren't quite wanted to keep the conversation open, the lines open. We've had times when conversation has been good and productive, and then it's deteriorated at times, and so we're trying to build that back, and we hope we can do that. And I hope that you also understand that when we raise questions, when we are trying to reflect what we see as our neighbors' concerns in a language that they're going to understand.
Sure.
And I think that's just very valuable. And all of our neighbors may not understand the very technical and difficult and intriguing engineering feat this is, but they all pretty well get that there's costs and there's benefits and nothing's free. And they need to understand how that all fits together. And the more you can help us with that and explain it in a way that people can understand and relate to and react to, that's very, very helpful.
Yeah, no, we're, happy to do that. I mean, trying to clean up a public liability by allowing the land to pay for it that it's on. I mean, that's kind of it in a nutshell, but yeah, I'm happy to, if you need me to have another conversation, Dorothy, lines are always open. I don't want to come back and just have a meeting to have a meeting. So when we have something to share, we'll come back and we'll share it with you and you can decide how far you need to disseminate it.
Okay, so thank you so very much.
You
And
bet.
all of you have a very happy holiday.
Thanks, you
And
too.
know that there's probably better things to be doing during the holiday season than this meeting, but that it's a very critical project. Will have a big impact, and we need involved citizens to help educate ourselves and educate our community and figure out what's going on and the cost of doing that. So thank you for
Right.
all.
All right.